Hello, everyone. My name is Joanne Lockwood, and I'm your host for the Inclusion Bites podcast. In this series, I have interviewed a number of amazing people and simply had a conversation around the subject of inclusion, belonging, and generally making the world a better place for everyone to thrive. If you'd like to join me in the future, then please do drop me a line to joe.lockwood@seechangehappen.co.uk. That's SEE changehappen.co.uk. You can catch up with all of the previous shows on iTunes, Spotify, and the usual places. So plug in your headphones, grab a decaf, and let's get going. Today is episode 80 with the title Beyond the Barriers. And I have the absolute honour and privilege to welcome Belinda Riley. Belinda describes herself as a diversity and inclusion consultant and also clinical hypnotherapist. When I asked Belinda to describe her superpower, she said that she truly cares and wants to get it right. Not just feel like she's right, whilst also recognising her own privileges and using those to help others. Hello, Belinda. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Joanne. Thank you very much for having me. It's lovely to see you again.
Yes, it's great to catch up. Belinda, tell me. We were speaking in the green room just before we went live, and we talked about beyond the barriers. What does that mean to you?
So beyond the barriers for me means a number of different things. And, in my work, I also do a number of different things. But in essence, it's about going beyond the barriers of either limiting beliefs that people have that hold them back from really achieving their potential or thriving, in all areas of their life. But it's also in my consultancy work, it's around going beyond the barriers of inequality to make workplaces work for everyone.
So limiting beliefs, yeah, that's. I think when we first met, probably about 4 or 5 years ago, I was probably going through a stage of my life where this sense of imposter syndrome, these limiting beliefs, these things hold you back. This little voice in your ear that says you can't. And many people suffer from that, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. And I'm fascinated actually about how imposter syndrome shows up for people. And, I've done a lot of work in this area and, there's lots of research in this space. And I think the research says that kind of 70% of women experience imposter syndrome, 40% of men. In my work, what I've kind of come across is realizing that most people experience some form of imposter syndrome or have some kind of imposter feelings that does hold them back. And, often, imposter syndrome can show up in loads of different ways of that idea of not feeling good enough, not feeling worthy enough, feeling like, that you don't belong or that you're a fraud and someone's going to find out that you don't really know as much as what you say or that aligns with what you're doing. But, for me, more importantly, when I've looked closely into imposter syndrome is seeing how much is being left on the table. How many great ideas, how much innovation, how many opportunities, how many ideas are people not following through because of those imposter feelings and those limiting beliefs and those words that they tell themselves. And, it's inspired me to really think more broadly around that. And how do I build awareness and kind of empower people to overcome those imposter feelings so that they can go on and achieve and thrive and realize and fulfill their potential?
So you said just now that proportionally more women experience it than men. And I also believe that it's kind of people from marginalised, minority or unheard voices backgrounds tend to be more. And is that down to socialisation more than anything, or is that just nurture? Is it nurturing, basically?
Well, what I've kind of discovered in the work that I have done is that I believe that imposter syndrome is actually compounded by the systemic barriers or the systemic inequality that exists in the world and in particular in the workplace. And I think often when people are talking about imposter syndrome, it's kind of saying that something's wrong with you as an individual for having these feelings. But often it's not explored within the context of the worlds of which we live and the worlds in which we work. And I think that that's why often in my experience and what I see, these imposter feelings are compounded for women and other sort of marginalized or underrepresented groups. And I think there's a reason for that. And I've looked really closely, because I think when I started looking at imposter syndrome, I remember when I moved from my career in the public sector into the private sector, I remember thinking, oh my God, I'm not going to fit. They've employed the wrong person. I'm going to get there and they're going to go, thanks so much for coming, Belinda. But, we've made the wrong decision, because I thought, based on my ideas about, the workplace, that I didn't really have a role. But what I realized quite quickly when I, started this new job is that I wasn't the only person who was experiencing these imposter feelings or this imposter syndrome. And, people who I was looking up to who were and are absolutely phenomenal, leaders of businesses, entrepreneurs. I had the privilege in my role of working with, royalty, with Olympic champions, Paralympic champions, world champions in athletes. And I couldn't believe that there was some similarity in around some of these imposter feelings. And it really triggered in me, where do these feelings come from? Why do people think they're not good enough, even when you've kind of achieved what most people would, only dream of achieving? And where does that come from? So I started kind of doing a little bit of inquiry. And, as you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, I'm also a hypnotherapist, and really interested in how sort of the mind works, and, the role of and the rules of the mind and the power of the mind. And I also had the privilege of studying with a phenomenal woman called Marissa Peer. I don't know if you've come across her before, but she's a phenomenal therapist. She coined rapid transformational therapy. And she was saying that in her kind of 35 years of being a hypnotherapist, a therapist, and she uses a number of different types of therapies, is that she identified that there was kind of 3 limiting beliefs that there's no boundaries to. This idea that you're not enough, that when you look up, what you want isn't available to you, or this idea that you don't fit or you don't belong. And so when I was sort of re-upskilling with her, I looked into that and was thinking about that in the context of the workplace and in the context of the work that I was doing around diversity, inclusion, and inequality. And my role was really, looking to, advance minorities or marginalized groups into leadership roles. It really got me thinking about those 3 factors and how does that actually show up in the workplace. And what I realized is that, when I was looking at, in particular women and other marginalized groups, we're constantly held to a kind of masculine standard around what is success. And we're often told that we need to work harder, that we need to do more to be successful, and there's often this ingrained belief in workplaces that we operate a meritocracy, that if you work hard, you will progress at the same rate as your peers. But the reality is that's not true. But the systems are designed to support that process. But then when I looked a little bit deeper as well, when you look up, it's not available to me. Well, when you look into companies and you look in businesses and you look in, who is in those senior leadership, for, again, women and marginalized groups, there's not that many people that look like you or sound like you. And then often, again, the same communities, when they're walking into a room and they look around, there is, again, only a few people that necessarily look like you. So when we come back to this idea of I don't belong, or I'm not enough, or I don't fit, that is kind of, or I'm a fraud, or people are going to find out I don't belong, you can kind of see that those limiting beliefs that we have are compounded every day to reinforce this idea that what you're seeing is actually true, because the world is telling you, and reinforcing some of those thought processes.
Yeah, I love that. You break the 3 down, and I always think that there's the old adage, and you can't be what you can't see, and not fitting, walking into a room being the only one, or seeing other people who are like you not succeeding as well as other people are. It creates that limiting belief. I agree completely, and I think you're also right about this perception about you've got to be superhuman sometimes. I can't show weakness. I can't show failure, and as a woman, we end up having to juggle multiple home tasks and work tasks and childcare tasks even in the most modern relationships, there's still that unbalanced burden, if you like, in many families. So trying to be superhuman, to do everything, or feeling like you're letting someone down if you can't do everything, is a massive challenge as well, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I think we put ourselves sometimes under so much pressure that it kind of reinforces this idea of if I make a mistake, or if I can't do everything that I said I'm going to do, or that I fail at something, that there's something wrong with me, that I'm not good enough. And almost it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy around this not enough feelings. And we often kind of, the words that we tell ourselves, and I think a lot of people don't realize this, is that the words we also tell ourselves are the most important words. And often we have such a strong inner critic. We're very good at internalizing the negative, and I just wish that we were just as good at internalizing the positives, our successes, and the things that we do well. And I think that if we're able to do that, we could start to kind of overcome some of those limiting beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, you've probably heard of the phrase "fake it till you make it,"
Yeah.
and sometimes it depends on how you say it and how you think about it, because it can be a kind of a negative term. But I also think it's your definition of faking it, because imposter syndrome is almost telling you that everything you're good at is fake. So sometimes you've just got to keep on believing in yourself that faking until you make it is not actually, you're not actually being fake. You're just being really, really hard on yourself, and you are good at what you can do.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you bring that up. I think that, in the work that I've been doing as a hypnotherapist, and again, studying with Marissa Peer, is understanding how the mind works. And there's what's called these rules of the mind. And this is where this idea of kind of faking it till you make it almost comes through. But let me give you kind of a new way of kind of reframing that, is that when we actually understand how our mind works, we can actually work with our mind rather than against it, because the mind doesn't actually distinguish between what is real or what is fake. What is fact, what is fiction. It's actually just listening and responding to the words that you tell it. So the whole idea that, you might not believe that you are talented at something, but if you tell yourself enough, then your mind will actually respond to the words that you're saying it. So, if we keep, our minds are designed to keep us safe, in essence. And this goes back, and I know that you've had lots of conversations with previous sort of guests around this idea. But our mind is designed to take us away from kind of keep us safe. And that also means that it takes us away from things that are perceived pain towards what is perceived pleasure or safety. But when we know that we can work with our minds to tell it what we want it to be, so we can shift from I'm not good enough to I am enough, through that consistency and that repetition, our mind starts to respond and believes what we tell it. And, so often people talk about this whole idea of affirmations, and, people go, oh, get a bit icky about sometimes affirmations. But in essence, affirmations are just the words that we tell ourselves all the time. And if we go back to what we were saying before, so often the words that we tell ourselves are very negative. I'm not good at that. No, I can't do that, or I'm failing, or that, or, people are going to laugh at me or judge me if I do those things. And they literally hold ourselves back. But if we start to tell ourselves a different narrative, because everything actually begins with a thought, and we've got the power to control our thoughts and change our thoughts. And our thoughts, everything starts with a thought that creates a feeling. And then that feeling kind of creates a behavior or an action that then kind of creates certain thoughts again. So coming back to that idea that you've got to fake it till you make it, actually, if you tell your mind something enough, it will start to believe it, and then your behaviors start to align with that belief system.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, looking back at my own journey of the last 6 years, and some of the early stages of that imposter syndrome, limiting beliefs, really, really impacted me. And one thing I identified was that I didn't have any benchmark to know how I was doing. I didn't have any positive reinforcement. I worked alone, like many of us do, with freelance or independent. So you haven't got colleagues around you saying, so you can compare notes, or even when they say, "Wow, you're doing amazing," you go. My reaction was, "No, I'm not. No, I'm not." I down talk that, almost embarrassed to be celebrating success, and I eventually overcame it by realizing that I was benchmarking against myself, and the incremental change was almost undetectable. It's a continuum, that very micro changes I was improving. And I had to start looking further back. So I had to start looking at myself a month ago or 2 months ago.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I started realizing that I was improving.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting that sometimes we forget where we started and that where we've come. And often when we start to change and develop and grow, sometimes that can feel very incremental. And as you said, unless we're kind of clear of where we started, and so often we don't, and often we fail to stop and celebrate our successes, our wins, some of the, whether they're big wins or small wins, and actually seeing the progress. And often our limiting beliefs are based on experiences that we had years and years and years and years ago and aren't actually relevant or aligned to where we are now. So the fact that you're able to see that, I think, is phenomenal. And I think sometimes we do just need to check in with, what is it that we've done? Where, look back at, see how far we've come, celebrate that, but also get clear about where we want to go. What is it? What does success look like to us? And then what is the action we need to be taking to achieve that?
Someone once said to me that it's a very British thing to be self-deprecating or not taking credit for what we can do. Is it just a British thing, or is it a world over trait? This is imposter syndrome.
That's a very good question. I was having this exact same conversation with a German friend of mine only a few days ago, and I think that in my experience, and I've had the privilege of working with people across cultures around the world. I think the term imposter syndrome is one thing, but I think what's sort of equivalent to the imposter feelings, I think, are fairly universal. I think it's just about how you describe it. So yes, I think the British do regularly say, and I'm an Australian, and I was trying to think about, are we self-deprecating in the same way that British people are? But I've been in Britain for so long, for 20 years, I can't quite distinguish what's different. But no, I do think that it's different interpretations of how you would describe imposter syndrome. But I do feel that when we're looking at kind of more broadly limiting beliefs, I feel that most people have them, and often those limiting beliefs stem all the way back into childhood. And it's about our interpretation. So you and I could have experienced very similar things or different things, but our limiting beliefs come from our interpretation of those events. And then every time we're in a situation where those feelings are triggered again, it kind of compounds those feelings of not being enough, or compounding those feelings of imposter syndrome.
So you said at the beginning that I introduced you as a diversity and inclusion consultant, and one of the things that I always find when I speak to people is that one of the biggest challenges they have is overcoming this fear of getting it wrong. So that everyone's worried about upsetting somebody to the point where they'd rather disengage than engage. So how do you get people comfortable having uncomfortable conversations, or feeling uncomfortable, if you like, around these kind of conversations out of their depth, whilst giving them a safe space?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, I think it's realizing that you're not alone. Most people are more worried about themselves than they are worried about the other person and what you think about them. And I think there's something quite freeing in that. Again, only the other day I was talking to an old colleague, and they're like, "Oh my God, I said that." And I was like, my goodness, nobody would have even noticed that. But what you felt, where you'd made a stumble or you'd done something wrong that you really noticed, nobody else even noticed that. So I think also, we're very, very harsh on ourselves. And I think sometimes we've just got to kind of let some of that go. I think that also, we have to get comfortable being uncomfortable and, creating space and kind of almost that psychological safety for people to be able to talk about issues and talk about different experiences, because otherwise, if we're not out there learning and building awareness and breaking down some of these barriers, nothing ever changes. And I regularly, and I do a lot of work with leaders, and a lot of leaders feel and say to me, but what happens if I say the wrong thing? And it's like, but yeah, you might say the wrong thing. But also, what is your intention? Actually, you often are speaking louder by not saying anything at all. And I know in talking to lots of people, the fact that people are willing to have that conversation and are open to learning and opening to making a mistake is far more engaging than feeling like you're not being seen, heard, or even being given the opportunity to have a voice.
Yeah. We do see countless examples, though, in the media where someone's made a slip up and they get berated for it. I mean, the recent example of the lady in waiting to our former queen, or our deceased queen, having a conversation to a black person who was a charity worker, and how that conversation went around where you're from. So people see that and they either go, "Oh, that makes me really nervous," or the opposite reaction is they get kind of defensive about this political correctness and wokeness in society, and you can't say anything these days without someone jumping on you. So how do we kind of have those conversations where we're helping people through that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think the social media has made life quite challenging for people. But also, I think in that example, there was a real lack of awareness. And I think that, when people do make mistakes and, what was said wasn't appropriate, and I think that they weren't being aware of the impact of that constant questioning about, but no, where are you really from, where are you really from, and the impact that has. I think that, for me, we have a responsibility to educate ourselves and to learn and to use those kind of moments around how do we actually reflect and what is the impact that has on other people's lived experiences. And I think that, for me, where I see a real issue is when people aren't open to that learning. And we talked at the beginning about privilege, and it is about recognizing that we have got certain privileges, but also it's around, there's a great quote that I often use in my work, and I better make sure I get it right. It's a Stephen Covey quote, is that, we see the world not as it is, but as we are. And I think that, for me, that's really important that we start from a place of acknowledging that and then being open to learning to make sure that, we do continue to evolve. I think it's difficult, though, I think, because a lot of people are persecuted for saying, the wrong thing. But I also think that, sometimes it's about the intent. And it's also recognizing, the barriers that certain people do face every day. And that was a classic example of that, of not recognizing and not being aware of, and not, I suppose, almost reinforcing an issue.
Yeah, I agree that most people are by definition good at heart. Most people want to do well in the world. They wake up with positive intent. But as we've discussed, the intent doesn't always cover the impact. We can have negative impact, and how do we slip up? How do we recover that if we realise we've created a negative impact or a problematic impact?
Yeah. Well, I think it's also about acknowledging it. It's not denying that it happened. I think that, we have to get comfortable owning our mistakes and acknowledging it. So acknowledging the mistake, apologizing for it, learning from it, but also then we need to be able to move on. And I think that, often we don't do that. And I see that. And I think actually one of the biggest barriers to, the work that, I know but both you and I are very passionate around, advancing equality in the workplace, is the denial of the inequality that exists, and people not taking responsibility for for making changes. There is enough information out there, for us to, just because you haven't experienced something or you haven't seen it or it hasn't affected you, it certainly doesn't mean that it hasn't happened. And I think we need, that for me is one of our greatest privileges, is being able to use that privilege to break down some of those barriers and using your voice and using your power and influence to start driving change. I often see, especially through this lens of diversity, equity, inclusion, is that we're asking minority groups to fix the problem. It is not their job to fix the problem of inequality. So again, it comes back to, for me, that education piece, but we also need to ensure that we're able to acknowledge when we have made a mistake and what we're actually going to do about that.
Yeah, it's so true. We can't, Black people can't fix racism.
No.
Women can't fix sexism, etc., etc. But what we often find is in our DEI space when we're having these conversations, it becomes an echo chamber.
Yeah.
It becomes an echo chamber of just within that community. So Black people talk about the challenges, or Black, brown people of color talk about the challenges they face, but white people aren't listening. So how do we get everybody in the room, through allyship, but how do we persuade people who are not part of those minority groups to engage and learn more about the challenges, the injustices, as you said?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that, there's a number of things. For me, it is around understanding, creating space and opportunities to build awareness and understanding. There is so much information out there, and it's about, how do people connect on a personal level. I think, as I said before, people have a responsibility to educate themselves, and to take action, and for people to be aware of, how they can leverage their power. Well, first of all, that they have got, power and influence. I think that there's also an opportunity in terms of ensuring that we're listening to people's lived experiences and creating that space to listen to people's lived experiences. And I think coming back to that privilege is, it's not always somebody's fault, but it is about recognizing that it exists. And I think I mentioned before, one of the biggest barriers is the denial that inequality exists in the first place. So how do we ensure, and I think that what I've seen is that everybody connects in different ways, so how do you create those aha moments for people, that they can connect with? I think that what I've often seen is that sometimes the messaging around diversity and equity and inclusion creates this zero-sum game. Like, to advance inequality means that other people need to miss out. And that's a real misconception. Everybody stands to gain. And I think for companies in particular, there is so much out there that shows that the companies who get this right are at a competitive advantage. So sometimes it's about, how do we ensure that people understand this in the right way around what some of the benefits are? There is a very, I often say there's no business case for the status quo, but I always say, well, tell me the business case. And, I do find that a little bit frustrating, but actually there's enough information out there that demonstrates the business case as well as the human case, but recognizing again that everybody stands to gain from getting this right. But I'd love to hear from you. How are you experiencing this? Because it is a challenge.
It is, and I have my own marginalised characteristic, and as a trans woman, like most people, we're recording this in February 2023. There's a lot of anti-trans rhetoric caused through the Scottish Gender Recognition Reform Bill, talking about there's transgender prisoners who have been convicted of rape. There's a whole load of rhetoric around, think about the women and children with damaging access, and all this focus on trans women. So it is, I'm well aware of the noise and this pervasive sort of like kind of drone in the air that I and other trans people feel, and it affects, we used the word earlier, psychological safety. It means I'm constantly on a state of awareness and stress and anxiety in certain situations. So, and it's really hard to, I think, as you said, you talk about the zero-sum game. I'm not trying to steal anybody's space. I'm not trying to take anything away from anybody. All I'm saying is, can I exist in the world? And you're not losing. There's nothing to lose here. If there are bad people, there are bad people. There are bad people in all walks of life.
Absolutely.
And just because you're transgender doesn't mean saying you're a bad person. So it's trying to, the effect is we dehumanize. And once you dehumanize, it gives society permission to treat you any way it likes without impunity. So I think what's happening is, the moment we see it through time. I was speaking to a lady yesterday around the dehumanization of Arabs and Muslims. We saw around the dehumanization of the Japanese people in America after Pearl Harbor. We saw it in the Second World War, and the Nazis around people who are Jewish. So we see these dehumanizing words. And we're seeing now, the worrying thing is we see the rise of the incel movement, the Andrew Tate, the toxic masculinity, dehumanizing women as such, as becoming property. So I think as much as we're pushing forward, we're having to hold our own at some point, because otherwise, if we don't hold, we're sliding backwards in some of these areas.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, at the heart of all of this, it is about being human. And I think there is a real reminder. And whilst I think when we look at what people experience, and as you've just explained, I don't think there's anybody in the world who has not felt at some point in their life what it feels like to be excluded or to be rejected. Just some people only have to experience this occasionally. And, often when I go into companies to work with them to really kind of help people connect with what we're trying to do, and the goal is helping people to connect with that. What does it feel like? Close your eyes. I sometimes do these visualization exercises. Just close your eyes for a minute and imagine, what does it like walking in and the only person, you open up your eyes and you're the only person that looks like you in the room. Remember that time when you weren't picked at school to go to a party, or you weren't invited to a party, or that you weren't chosen to be on a sports team. Being rejected from a date. You ask somebody out and they say no. All of these feelings are kind of universal, those feelings of not fitting in, and it comes back to what I was saying before, not feeling worthy, not feeling enough. And then it's, for me, when people can connect with that, imagine feeling like that every day. That every day you step out of your house, and, as women, we have different thought processes to men because of safety, every day, and I have these conversations regularly. Do you even think about what it feels like to have to think, right, am I going to be coming home late tonight when it's dark? Am I safe to do that? Can I get transport? How am I going to get home? Does anybody even know where I am, for example? And I know that happens for women and, for Black boys in particular, as well out in the community because of these stereotypes. But when people can actually connect, I think sometimes to some of those human behaviors and make a connection, then that for me sometimes is a trigger to get people thinking in a different way.
It was certainly something I had not foreseen when I transitioned 6-7 years ago. As we grow up, we learn these social constructs, we learn our behavior model, we learn all these things. And what I hadn't appreciated was the need to unlearn to allow me to relearn. And I experienced some safety issues that completely came from left field. I had no idea this was going to happen. I was so unprepared. Fortunately, nothing terrible happened, but it was like a real jolt. I went, I can't do this anymore without thinking. I have to plan this. I have to be aware of this. I need to check that someone is watching me in case this goes wrong. I'm not alone here. I've got support if I need it in a bar or wherever that may be. And it was a really, really scary, enlightening, but also a wake-up call around my own set of privileges that I hadn't even thought about. And now I erased those privileges, and I suddenly had this new feeling. And the number of stories. I was at a dinner a couple of weeks ago with two other women. We're sitting having a conversation. They both looked at their watch at a certain point and went, we better be going home soon. I don't want to get that last tube. I don't want to get that last train. I want to make sure I go now. I don't want to have to get my keys out and hold them between my fingers. I thought, this isn't conversations. This is normal conversations that women have around the table at that time of night. that again, I was kind of going, you're right. Yes, you're right. I'm still trading off that old privilege.
Yeah. And often people don't necessarily realize, well, what's the impact of that? What is the emotional load with having to think about elements of your identity each and every day? We talk a lot, don't we, around, health, well-being, mental health. These thoughts, as you've just described as well, is, that can have quite a profound impact on people. And you think about your kind of working memory, if a percentage of your time and energy is thinking about this, what is the impact that has in other areas of your life? And if we connect that to the workplace, how does that impact productivity in the workplace if people are already having to think about all of those things before they even start the day? So again, coming back to, there's, companies and businesses need to think about that, because, there's so much, again, being left on the table because people are worrying about things because they can't be their authentic selves, because that's not what fits or what belongs. And, again, there's something that everybody can gain by creating a place where people can turn up and be themselves, that there's modifications to create the right environment for people to thrive. Now, that's for me around, there's a great image, and I'm sure you've seen it before, that describes equality versus equity, where you see people on bikes. We shouldn't be treating everybody the same, because that's not recognizing or understanding some of the barriers or modifications that people need to be able to get on the right size bike so that they can get to the finish line.
Yeah, I think it was JFK. Rising water floats all boats evenly. So what we have to recognise is we need to add enough water so that we are floating everybody. But it starts at the lowest boats first and then raises to the highest boats. So that's recognising that people need this equity. We need to invest in people, understand the barriers, the additional challenges of being them. And I think you're right when you're talking about this extra load. It's cognitive load. And my background's in IT. I used to be a programmer many, many years ago. And I always think about these little things, the little subroutines in my head. So am I safe? Am I going to be disrespected? Is someone going to misgender me? Is this going to happen? So all these little things are firing off before I can actually do the proper thinking.
Yeah.
I've almost got this extra burden every time. I'm going tick, 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 tick. Yeah, good. Right, carry on. And that could be limiting beliefs. It could be all this other stuff in there, all part of this load that I and others have to consider through lack of privilege or whatever it may be, that others may not have to. Maybe they have their own subroutines, their own challenges. But yeah, it's definitely, I feel that cognitive load there now.
Yeah. And that's really powerful. And I think there's also things that we can do to take some of that away, for people. What can we do? We shouldn't be adding to that by, constantly having to either fix the problem or, fixing different things within workplaces. I think that, those in positions of power and influence don't, I think, realize that they can do things differently to alleviate some of that emotional load, or even just recognizing that that's what people experience every day in certain areas.
And being the only one in a room should not be underestimated what a load that is, because in one respect you're representing everybody who's like you. The conversations are harder. You're looking out for microaggressions or discriminatory comments or those challenges, and you're worried about your personal safety. You're worried about a whole load of factors going on, psychological safety. And I think a lot of workplaces are set up so there are many places where you are the only one. So if you're a young black woman trying to succeed and go into leadership roles, there are many role models in there. So what can organizations do around coaching and mentoring and support programs? It's equity we talked about, isn't it? It's about equity.
Yeah. I mean, something that I'm really passionate about and have been doing a lot of work and have been seeing quite phenomenal impact is sponsorship programs. And the reason why I think sponsorship is probably one of the most influential factors in kind of advancing inequality or advancing equality in the workplace is it shifts the responsibility around who's kind of accountable for change. So, traditionally, and I think this is done with really great intention, we have all of these programs that focus on the minority, whether that's women, whether it's ethnic minorities, et cetera, et cetera. But I think unintentionally, it's also the message is we're trying to fix people to fit into an environment where they don't fit. But actually, if we shift that towards, well, actually, what can we do to actually enable, because people don't need fixing, they just need the right environment for them to thrive. And that might be different to what certain people need. But when we talk about people who are individuals and looking at what people individually need, then we're going to have far greater success. And, what we've discovered, or what I've discovered through sort of different parts of work that I've done, is that, often people have access to sponsorship informally by those who are in the majority. We all have affinity bias. Every single one of us. We have a very much human behavior. And in essence, affinity bias is that we like to surround ourselves with people that are similar to us or that we can connect on. And I think that dates right back to tribal times, that if you're a part of a tribe, you're part of a community, you were safer. And if you stepped outside of that, you were at risk. The thing is we're not back there. We're not in the same place anymore. But also that kind of idea of being around people who are like us does make us feel broadly safer. And as a result of that, and as a result of people who are in the majority, those who are like that get access to, whether that be networks, whether that's opportunities, whether that's information, and that creates huge amounts of advantages and opportunities for those. So when we're looking at kind of formal sponsorship programs, when you can help especially leaders in business understand the barriers that people face and how that is compounded when you apply intersectional lenses. And once they recognize that, but they can actually do something to support those people by giving them access to influential networks, information, opening doors, creating visibility, it can lead to huge differences for those people. But for me, that's around really active, visible and accountable sponsorship. Now, what I've also seen is a lot of people think that they're sponsoring others, but they're not. They're mentoring them. And the difference, for me, is sponsorship is about how you use your influence for others. Mentoring is about sharing information, but it's really about what you do when somebody's not in the room. So, if people are really looking at ways to advance sort of representation or diversity in workplaces, my top tip often is around look at your sponsorship programs, look at formal sponsorship programs. Let's look at the systems. Let's break down those barriers that exist. Let's challenge this belief of meritocracy, and let's really make a difference.
Yeah, the myth of meritocracy is still powerful, isn't it? I've been in a room full of recruiters, and they all pipe up, yes, but the best person gets the job. And I say, using whose criteria? And it's about who designs the criteria. It designs the meritocracy, and the criteria is designed often with bias, own lens stuff. You're looking at yourself, or I've got a Trevor and I want another Trevor. That's what we're saying, isn't it? And that's often how the meritocracy is designed. Someone just like that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I leveraged this term called meritocracy that I came across because actually I think that what most companies do, again, unintentionally and unconsciously, is that they kind of employ, promote, develop people who look and sound like those who are currently in positions of power. And this term meritocracy was originally coined in Silicon Valley with a recognition that those in the tech industry, they weren't being employed based on their merit. They weren't being employed based on their skills. They were being employed based on who looked like those that were already there. And what that meant, and the bigger impact, is that they were missing out on the skills that actually were going to help them and enable the businesses. And I see that play out again and again in businesses at the moment. And the other question I often challenge people is, well, why would someone want to come and work in your organization? And I think that if you can answer that question, that's what's going to attract people in. Do you actually value the uniqueness that individuals bring? Do you create the space for people to have a voice? Because I often say, oh, yeah, we really value diversity, equity, and it's really important to us. Well, show me, what does that actually look like for you? Why would a trans woman want to come and work in your business? Are they going to be set up for success? And what are you going to do to enable them to be successful? What does that actually look like? And for me, there's some of the tough conversations we really need to have, because, when you start asking those questions, I'm not sure that everybody always has an answer. And I think that, going back to what we were talking about, being, unlearning and then having to relearn, is I think that there's a lot of that needs to happen. But again, we need to create the space for people to be able to do that, to think about, is how do we value people who are different, and how do we create the right environment for people to thrive?
When we're trying to diversify, and I did some air quotes when I said diversify there.
People can't see some nice air quotes.
Are we in danger of creating a stereotype around the person we're trying to hire? And what I mean by that is, often when we say, why do we want to hire more women? And often we'll say, we need more empathy, we need more compassion, we need more soft skills into our teams. That's making the quantum assumption that women have those skills more than other people. And that's creating a stereotype that women are naturally more emotional and compassionate. And that's saying that men can't be. So we're almost creating a reverse bias there to justify why we should hire more fairly. And I think sometimes we get sucked up into these other stereotypes, and unfairly hiring women just because they're emotional and compassionate and have high EQ, supposedly.
Well, actually, I think there is some research that supports, some of those statements. But I think more importantly is, I think that it's redefining, what are the skills that we actually need. And I think that, both, and not putting people into these gendered stereotypes. But I think that, because men can be very emotionally intelligent and can have empathy, and there's women that don't have empathy. So it shouldn't necessarily keep putting people into boxes. It's about, what are the skills that we need? What does, a leader look like in our business? And who are the best people then to deliver on that? And it goes back to your point, is, are we even clear around, what are the skills and capabilities that we actually want and need for a business to thrive? And I think that has changed. And I think that there's a recognition that there's certain skills that we need more of in the future world of work than before. And I think that is constantly evolving and changing as well. But I think that it shouldn't necessarily just be defined about a woman brings this, or a man brings this, or somebody from this community brings this. It's actually, being clear on the skill set, and then starting from there.
Yeah, and also building trust as well, isn't it? If I was talking to somebody the other day, and what we're talking about here is diversity isn't about Noah's Ark. It's not having two of everybody, or one of this, or some of that. And we've got to have this matrix of different personalities and identities. It's around the people who we have, trusting the people in leadership or the mission of the organization to support them, recognize them, empower them, look after them, create their belonging, create their culture. So you may be the only one. I mean, I'm the only one often.
Yes.
But it doesn't worry me, provided I trust the environment I'm in to respect and look after me and not break me.
Yeah. And that comes back to that psychological safety, isn't it? Is that, if you go into an organization and everyone looks and sounds the same, what you could determine from that is that they're not valuing difference. And it's not always about having to see a complete replica of yourself. But if there is people who are representative of different backgrounds, different, whether that's socioeconomic background, different educational backgrounds, different ages, all those different elements, people who are neurodivergent, if you've got people who are representative of difference, it shows that, well, my difference can be, is more likely to be valued and accepted, because we're being, there appears to be, because of what I'm seeing, people are there because of their uniqueness and the diversity of what they bring, rather than, oh, there's 4 women, there's 4 of this and there's 4 of that. And I think that, often people think that diversity, or having certain diversity, is fixing the problem of inequality. For me, diversity is an output of inclusion and belonging.
Oh, yeah. I often talk about that, where people focus on these diversity initiatives, diversity hiring. Let's go out, hire more people. And I always say, no, hiring is the last thing you do, not the first thing you do. And it's about getting your culture right. If you get your culture right with your values and alignment, belonging occurs. If belonging occurs, inclusion occurs. If inclusion occurs, you will be more diverse because you're welcoming people. If you get the diversity right, you're going to be compliant, because that you won't get things. So it all starts with culture, starts with belonging, starts with those values.
Absolutely. And I think that, again, this is where some of the messaging, has been misconstrued almost, is that, but I've done this, I've hired that and it didn't work. And, what frustrates me sometimes about that is, oh, no, but we put women into leadership roles, but they weren't successful. And it's like, well, did you look at why? Did we actually set people up for success? Just putting someone into any role. You're not going to put a doctor all of a sudden become a lawyer and expect them to thrive because they thrive somewhere else. We have to really set people up for success. What support does somebody need to be successful in that role? And again, I think it comes back to the why. Why is this important? And understanding, why this hasn't been successful in the past. And I think it's unpacking that. And I think that, again, it comes back to, do we understand the different lived experiences of people? And just because something worked for you, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work for others.
It's this concept of the concrete cliff, isn't it, where it's really hard to break through the glass ceiling. But what happens is you get there and you realize you don't like it. You jump off the concrete cliff because it's so toxic. You don't want to be there anymore. So it really is making sure that you are, as you say, providing that support, that nurturing, recognizing the equity that needs to be pumped into this circumstance. And people might say, well, we don't need to do that with men. They just get on with it. Yeah, but that's not necessarily a fair representation, because maybe these men have been nurtured already and they don't necessarily have all the skills. So maybe instead of focusing on these man attributes, we look at adaptability, learning quotient, all these other things we talk about in the future. Recognizing the world of work in 10 years' time is completely different to the world of work today. I mean, if you just look at what's happening with AI, Chat GPT at the moment, the world's going crazy about AI, image generation. Everyone's already talking about this AI taking over the world. And so if we're now generating content and products using AI, where do all these other roles go? So it's in the same paradigm shift as Deliveroo, as Uber, as Facebook, as all these social media stuff. We didn't have that 10 years ago. Now we have. So we look forward 10 years, the world of work is going to be phenomenally different than this today. And we need to hire people who are ready for that change.
Yeah. And, I love that quote, what got us here isn't what's going to get us there. And for me, that's about, we have to keep evolving and responding. And the world is changing, as you said, it's so rapidly. If we look back, what's happened in the last 4 to 5 years, probably the last time, you and I were in person together, how much has changed? That we didn't foresee. And I think that, again, this is about how can we be agile? How can we be flexible? How do we adapt to these changes? And, I always try and look for some of the positives. And, COVID was pretty horrendous for most people. And again, I think there was some good things from that. And there was, some things that, we really struggled with. And I know for me, not being able to see my family back in Australia was really difficult. But, when I come back to thinking about COVID within the context of the working world, it busted so many myths about the way we used to work that I think kind of reinforced and prevented us from really shifting the dial when it came to inclusion and belonging perspective. Because, I used to always get told, oh, Belinda, people have to be in the office, people have to be on client sites. Well, actually, in the firm I used to work with, we managed to mobilize over 300,000 people within a week, and technology has enabled that to happen, and still able to deliver solutions for clients, still able to team, to still be able to collaborate, and still be able to be successful. So, it's always about, for me, how do we reimagine? What else can we do? What can we learn to keep moving forward? And I think there's some huge opportunities that came out of that. And I don't think we've quite landed on, what that looks like going forward. And I know lots of people and companies are struggling with that. But I think it also opened up a huge talent pool, because there was a lot of people who weren't able to participate within the workforce because of that needing to be present, whether or not that was around, getting into the cities, how expensive that is, with people with caring responsibilities, people with disabilities, or a number of different reasons that may have prevented people, that has now opened up. And I think for a lot of companies, the biggest challenges that they have at the moment is winning the war on talent. Well, there's a lot of great talent out there. How do we think differently so that, you're the one that gets access to that talent?
And talent is more empowered, more enlightened. Talent knows different now. Talent knows it can work from home. And I often wonder what the motivation is driving some of big businesses. I know that the government are worried about the rail infrastructure, the underground infrastructure, not having enough people to keep it viable. We've got dead in the cities, coffee bars, cafes, all this economy closing down. So there's an immense pressure to get people back to the office just for the economies in that area, without necessarily thinking about the benefit to people. And I think when I hear people talking about big global leaders talking about we need to get people back in the office because it means the creativity, mentoring, learning of each other, coffee machine, water cooler chats. And I think, okay, I get that. There is some power and some benefit of have face-to-face contact. I value it as well. But for me, when the answer to every question is back in the office, that's where it falls over. The answer to every question is, what can we do in this particular case? And I think we need to recognize that back in the office is not the only answer or the default answer to everything. So it's about being more innovative. Yeah. Local hubs, work clubs, that kind of stuff in local businesses.
Yeah, I used to always laugh that often we're in the office and everybody's at their computer with the headphones on, so you can kind of do that from anywhere. So I think it's just about being creative and imaginative around how do we use certain spaces, and do you come in for those collaborative days or those days for teaming? And then do you have those meetings structured in a different way? I mean, to be honest, I don't have all the answers, but I do think there's an opportunity to really think through different things that creates more opportunity for more people to participate. And when we look at, generations, and I think this is the first time in history, isn't it, that we have 5 generations in the workforce at one time, all with differing needs, all with differing expectations. And so how do we manage some of that? But if we don't, we are also missing, and again, comes right back to what I was saying at the beginning, is about how much is left on the table by not creating the right environment for people to thrive. And, when we look at, the new generations coming through, they're very clear that they will not work in an organization or a company that does not value them for who they are. And they're demanding, I think the latest research is 80% of this community want inclusion. And if they get somewhere and people aren't delivering on their promises, they're off. They're not going to stay. And, that's a hugely expensive exercise for companies. So, there's a real opportunity for people to get this right that benefits everybody.
Fantastic. That's an awesome place that we can close this down and draw a line there. That was immensely inspiring. That last words you said there. So Belinda, it's been an absolute pleasure. So how can our audience get in touch with you? What's the best way to connect?
So the best way probably to connect with me is either through LinkedIn. Is a great way, and often people connect with me there, either via email. So that's belinda@belinda-riley.com. People can find me there. I'm also on Instagram, which is @Belinda_Riley. And I'm just in the process of designing and developing a new app. So when that comes out, it's going to be called Beyond the Barriers. So that's a nice little connection to our conversation. So I think you just type that into the App Store at some point soon, and you can find me there as well.
Fantastic. Thank you once again.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you to all the listeners. Thank you for listening this far, tuning in. Please do subscribe. You'll be notified of future episodes of the Inclusion Bites podcast. That's BITES. If you haven't already shared it with your friends and colleagues, then please do. I've got a number of other exciting guests lined up. I'm sure you'll be equally inspired by over the next few weeks and months. Of course, if you'd like to be a guest yourself, please let me know. Just drop me an email